Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I'd also like to pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. The session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video input or audio from participants. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Michael, and I am Project and Research Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to discuss UTS ACRI's newly released report, The Australia-China Science Boom, authored by Professor James Laurenceson, Director of UTS ACRI, and myself. The report presents the latest data on collaboration between Australian and Chinese researchers in the creation of new knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge. The report also provides analysis of recent developments and their implication for the future trajectory of this Australia-China research collaboration. Lead author James Laurenceson will be giving a presentation of the report's key findings, and he'll be joining John Ross for an in-conversation style discussion. Audience questions are welcome at the end. Now a little bit about the speakers. Professor James Laurenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. He also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship in such publications as the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and South China Morning Post, amongst many others. John Ross has held the role of Asia-Pacific editor for Times Higher Education since February 2018. He was previously higher education and science correspondent with the Australian newspaper. He has twice won the National Press Club's Higher Education Journalist of the Year award, most recently in 2018, and has been shortlisted 5 times. Mr. Ross holds a communications degree from the University of Technology, Sydney. I'd now like to welcome Professor James Laurenceson to give an outline of the findings of UTS ACRI's latest report.
Thank you very much, Michael, and it's great to have Michael introducing both John and I, being the co-author of this report. So if I have any technical dramas, it's good to know that Michael will be able to take up the slack very, very quickly. Folks, let me just cross my fingers and share my screen, and hopefully that'll get us started. Okay, I hope you're all seeing what I'm seeing now. Michael and I have written a number of reports over the last couple years together, but a theme of the more recent ones is to look at this issue of research collaboration between Australia and China. Before running through the key findings of the latest report, I just wanted to take one step back and reflect on Australia's relationship with China a bit more broadly and previous booms the Australian economy has experienced as a result of China. Of course, the China boom that we're all most familiar with when it comes to China as Australians is the China mining boom, which hit the Australian economy in a very positive way halfway through the 2000s. Already by 2011, we have folks like Glenn Stevens, who was the former governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, making public statements like this one, saying that the proverbial pet shop goer can by now recite the facts on Australia's trade with China and our terms of trade, which are at a level not seen in over a century. Making the point that Australia's trade relationship with China, by this time was already being widely discussed and having a major impact. Now, over time, the China mining boom eased off in terms of prices. Around 2012, iron ore prices started edging down from the historical highs. But rather than that being the end of Australia's China boom, what we saw, in fact, was a new China boom developing. And that was resulting from the shift in China's own economy away from investment, which heavily used Australian resources such as iron ore, towards consumption, being driven by the Chinese middle classes. That's a shift in China's economy that is a boom by any description. I think back to research undertaken by the Brookings Institution in the US, where the data was put that between 2009 and 2030, 850 million more Chinese would enter the middle class. Now, we saw the effects of that in Australia come the 2010s. I think back at this report, which was commissioned by the Australia-China Business Council, titled The Long Boom. What it was talking about, it wasn't talking about the mining boom. It was talking about a boom for Australian agricultural producers, providing their high value-added outputs, supplying their high value-added outputs to the Chinese middle classes, and also the boom that Australia's education and tourism industries, our services sectors, were experiencing as a result of the expansion of China's middle classes as well. My colleague at the University of New South Wales, Tim Harcourt, described it as a mining boom to a dining boom. Interestingly though, while the dining boom was taking off, the mining boom never actually went away. In fact, what we're experiencing in Australia over the last few years is both a mining boom and a dining boom. Our agricultural and services exports to China have never been higher, but nor have our exports of energy and raw materials and commodities like iron ore as well. That said, despite these double booms, there's still been some skepticism about the value of Australia's economic relationship with China. I think of this piece as an example. This was from Simon Jackman, the CEO of the United States Studies Centre back in 2017. And he made the argument that, look, sure, trade with China is valuable for our balance sheet, but he quickly qualified that and argued that it shouldn't be equated towards US investment, shouldn't be compared with the value of the direct investment from the United States. To use his words, nor should our exports to China, tilted heavily towards resources, agricultural products, undergraduate commerce degrees, and inbound tourism, nor should those products be equated with US-sourced investments in technology-rich sectors that continue to grow Australia's stock of human capital and technological capacity. Well, I've got a few issues with that statement as an economist, but I'll say something positive. And what I will say is Simon's absolutely right to emphasize the importance of human capital and technological capacity. And there's no doubt that Australia's relationship with the United States does indeed deliver that to the Australian economy. And that's a very good story for the Australian economy. What I think this statement misses, though, is that it's an outdated description of Australia's relationship with China. And it's important we recognise what's happening right up to the minute. So last year, Michael and I started looking at this issue of research collaboration in scientific fields with China. And it's fair to say that despite working in a university, you might think we'd be very familiar with this. The data even surprised us. In 1998, only 1% of Australia's scientific publications involved a collaborator affiliated with a Chinese institution. By 2018, that had grown to 15%, meaning that China was our number 2 partner in international research collaboration. The United States remained number 1. Now, we pointed out in that report last year that if the current trajectories remained on track, then this year, China would in fact overtake the United States as Australia's major source of international collaboration for scientific publications. So our latest report looks at this exact issue. Let me run through very quickly some of the key findings of our new report. Well, indeed, the data is now in, and China is Australia's leading collaborator in producing scientific publications, jumped by nearly 13% last year. Those with the United States remain important. Don't get me wrong, the fact that China's #1 is not to dismiss the United States in any sense, but last year, those with the volume, the scale of that collaboration with the United States somewhat flatlined, and it is now second to China. China accounts for more than 16%. The United States is 15.5%. And then you can see Australia's other top 5 collaborators there as well. Now, of course, there's always issues about how you measure this stuff. But before we go to a different metric, I thought I'd just put Australia's collaboration with China in a comparative context. At 16.6%, that means around about 1 in 6 Australian scientific publications involve a China-affiliated researcher. That's a bit higher than in some other countries, such as the United States, where the share is around 10%. That said, there's other countries that have an even greater intensity in their collaboration with China. Singapore, for example, 1/3 of Singapore's publications involve Chinese collaboration. Now, the previous slide was simply looking at the share of Australia's total scientific publications that involved Chinese collaboration. Here's a different measure that looks at impact. You say this is a measure of quality. And here we look at the number of Australian publications appearing in the global top 1% of most cited publications. So the argument here is that if a publication is frequently cited, then it's an indicator of that publication's high quality. Well, the United States remains #1 by this metric. That said, you can see the data, it's pretty plain. That with China, increased rapidly last year. China is now on par with the United Kingdom as Australia's #2, a second most important partner by this metric. And interestingly, China was the only one to experience an increase. The number of high impact Australian publications with the United States, the UK, Germany and Canada all fell in the most recent year for which data is available. The other thing we tried to do was to put this into a bit of a subject discipline perspective. Which areas is Australian research, scientific publications, which do they most frequently involve Chinese collaborators? And then we rank them. So if you look at that first column there, you'll see around 2/5, 40% of Australia's publications in material science involved a researcher affiliated with a Chinese institution. That is a significant share. You'll see the second column from China's perspective, it looks very different. Only 2.2% of China's publications in material science involves a researcher affiliated with an Australian institution. And the third column and the fourth column, we put it in a global context. So Australia produced 2.1% of global publications in materials science last year, compared with China, which produced 37%. So there's a very serious gulf there between the contribution of Australia to global knowledge creation in material science versus that for China. The observation I'd make looking at this slide is that the areas that Australia is most intensively collaborating with China in, column 1, are in fact the areas in which China is a global leader, i.e. column 4. So I think this gets at the point that Australian researchers aren't in the business of charity. They want to work with the best. And the fact that they are partnering with Chinese institutions in the fields in which China excels is pretty plain from the data you see in front of you. You could do the same analysis for our most cited publications, that is those high impact publications. So for example, 81%, more than 81% of Australia's highest impact publications in mathematics involves a Chinese collaborator. Again, the perspective from China is different. Only 4% of China's most cited publications in mathematics involve an Australian collaborator. And you can see the global shares there. When it comes to high impact mathematics publications, Australia's share is modest, China's share is massive. So it's not surprising that Australian researchers want to work with China in those areas. Okay, that's the data treatment. It's interesting, before I made the point that when it comes to Australia's goods and services trade with China, there's some skepticism about the value of that for the Australian economy, despite the numbers being extremely large. It's interesting, when you look at scientific collaboration with China, you don't just see skepticism questioning the scale of the benefit for Australia. You actually see a lot of skepticism whether it is beneficial for Australia's national interest at all, or if in fact it hurts Australia's national interest. I'll leave you to read the report for all the details, but these are just some of the quotes that we noted from commentators in this space. There's been allegations that by working with Chinese partners, our science and technology priorities are being set by the Chinese government. Well, not by Australian interests. In other words, they're being determined by the interests of China. Here's one from Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who wants to know how much of our research capability has been essentially surrendered to the Chinese in the name of scientific collaboration. He says Australian universities have been played by savvier counterparts looking to steal intellectual property that will give China a military edge. These aren't shy allegations, they're very bold ones, and they very much question whether this research collaboration with China is in Australia's national interests. And here's one from Clive Hamilton, who says it's very clear that Australian universities are not on the ball, and in fact they've been likely passing on valuable information to Chinese companies and Chinese intelligence agencies. Well, let's just be clear. Clive Hamilton is saying this collaboration is involving Australian researchers committing treason, right? Let's not beat around the bush. Valuable information being passed on to Chinese intelligence services. That's pretty much a definition of treason. Well, in response, I'd just make a few observations. Again, I've only got a few minutes, so I'd encourage you to read the full report to see these fleshed out a bit. But the first point is this: making an insinuation and repeating an allegation may build a narrative, but it doesn't constitute facts or rigorous evidence. And there's nothing wrong with raising questions, but when those questions aren't then supplemented by facts and evidence, I think that is extremely damaging to an accurate assessment of Australia's national interests, and it absolutely, in Australia's national interest, it absolutely deserves to be pushed back against. I think of some of the collaborations my own institution, the University of Technology, has had thrown at it. There were allegations that some of our researchers were working with Chinese companies on technologies that were repressing China's minority Uyghur population in Xinjiang, for example. Well, rightly, the university was quite alarmed by that allegation. Headlines splashed on the papers. The university conducts an investigation, and it turns out that there's absolutely no basis, dead wrong, that allegation has no basis in facts and evidence. But of course, those claims are not revisited by the media. The splash is made, and we move on to the next one. I think that that process is not a healthy one, and it deserves to be called out. Second point, there's nothing wrong. No one argues that at the individual research project level, in choosing particular Chinese collaborators, we have to exercise careful due diligence. But there is an issue here of not wanting to cut off our nose to spite our face. Take material science as an example here. That's precisely a field of collaboration that some commentators have said Australian universities are assisting the Chinese military in. Well, what's the bigger picture there? The bigger picture is Australia produces 2.1% of global publications in material science. China produces 37% of global publications in material science. Those numbers alone make it very clear that if Australia wants to be at the leading edge of scientific knowledge creation in material science, we need to be engaging with China intensively in that space. Finally, let's not forget that the Australian government and universities as well are not asleep at the wheel here. We do have regulatory frameworks in place. I'm thinking particularly of defence trade controls here. And despite the tens of thousands of research papers that have been written between Australian and Chinese researchers, at the end of 2018, Greg Moriarty, the Secretary of Defence, questioned about this. He confirmed that there had been precisely zero instances of non-compliance by universities with these defence trade controls that the Australian government has put in place to ensure there's no inappropriate leakages of Australian technology. And finally, there is also sometimes this view that the Australian government is asleep at the wheel. Well, let's just call that out as being dead wrong as well. Defence trade controls were only updated in 2015, and at the beginning of last year, they were independently expert reviewed as well to ensure that they remained fit for purpose. So they're regularly reviewed, and universities have a strong compliance record. They are the facts. And I think those making allegations suggesting that those facts are wrong really do need to front up with some facts and evidence of their own, not simply make slurs and allegations against universities and particularly against individual scientific researchers. I'll finish on this point, John. As we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, the Morrison government has made clear that it's going to be industry-led, not government-led. And Karen Andrews, the Minister for Innovation and Science, has emphasised that science and technology will be the enablers of this industry-led recovery. Well, if you're talking industry, if you're talking science and technology, it's pretty clear from the hard data that China is well placed to be a very important partner to Australia in this recovery. So Australia is going to have differences with China because our values and interests sometimes clash. But at the same time, let's not miss a broader picture where there is much strong collaboration between these two countries taking place that is firmly in Australia's national interest. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen there. I hope I stuck to time, and I look forward to having a conversation with John.
Well, thanks, James. Look, I'd like to start with the data, I guess. Essentially what your report says that 1 in every 6 Australian research publications has Chinese co-authors, and 2%, give or take, of Chinese research publications have Australian authors. Does that mean they're a hell of a lot more important to us than we are to them?
That would be the easy interpretation, John. And it's got some truth to it, right? That's the reality. Only 2% of Chinese publications involve an Australian affiliated author. So there's some truth to it. That said, I don't want to give any support to this view that China collaborates, that we owe China something, right? Just like when China buys our iron ore, China's not doing it out of charity. China is buying our iron ore because it's in their interest to do so. So even though that collaboration with Australian authors is a much smaller proportion of the Chinese total, China's doing it because it's in China's interest to do so. What I don't think we should then conclude, though, or frame this debate in, is a zero-sum view of the world. So this idea that if it's in China's interest, therefore Australia's losing. No, hang on. This is a positive-sum game we're talking about here. It may well be in China's interest, and it is certainly in Australia's interest as well. So we can both do better from this collaboration.
I guess following up from that point, I mean, what's clear to me in the data that you present in the report is that, on the whole, collaboratively written papers are more likely to be highly cited than papers that don't have international co-authors. So is everybody winning out of this? And are we all more important to each other than we realised?
Absolutely. And this is why, John, you would know this, for a very long time, the Australian government has been very upfront and open about that they want Australian universities to work with international partners. And by the way, I don't want to this observation that China is Australia's leading partner in producing scientific publications, I don't want to turn this into some silly competition with America, right? That China has somehow shoved America out of the game and it's now in number 2. No, our collaboration with America is very much in Australia's interests too. And in fact, not in this report, but in the report Michael and I authored last year, one of the standout findings of that report was the areas that we work with China in generally are actually quite different to the areas that we work with the United States in. And it's simply reflecting the fact that we work with China in the areas where China is particularly strong and the United States where the United States is particularly strong. So these are complementary relationships, not zero-sum competition.
Yeah. Another thing that the report shows was that largely the areas that we work with China on are also the areas that the US works with China on, material science, chemical engineering, energy. What do you make of that? Is it that China has particular strengths in these areas and we really need those strengths, or what's happening here?
That's exactly the interpretation I put on it. There's a lot of talk these days about a US-China decoupling, and I agree, things are trending in that direction. If I could single out a particular report, there was Brendan Thomas-Noon, a researcher at the United States Study Centre last month, had a report on this very topic, and how under President Trump, it is increasingly going to be harder for United States researchers to partner with Chinese collaborators, and Australian researchers may come under pressure from the Trump administration in that space as well. But in this report Michael and I have published, we did note that last year, 2019, the proportion of American publications involving Chinese collaborators actually continue to increase as well. So I still think that's a very fluid space, and you're quite right to observe that the United States is collaborating with China in the exact same areas that Australia is collaborating with China in, and there really can only be one interpretation to that, and that is that China has particular strengths in those areas.
Yeah. Going back to the merits of collaboratively, always have problems with that word, written papers. In general terms, they tend to be more highly cited. Is that because they're of higher innate quality, or is it more an exposure thing? If you're an Australian researcher and manage to co-write with a Chinese author, all that Chinese author's mates are going to read their papers and maybe cite you. Is it an exposure thing?
Look, I think it's a bit of both, but I think the driving factor here is quality. When it comes to scientific research, there's an enormous amount of resources that are required in terms of labs and so on, in terms of raw brain power. So it simply makes intuitive sense that co-authored publications with the best, not just amongst Australia's 25 million population, but amongst the world's 6-7 billion population, that is inherently going to give you better outcomes than you would if you're just doing it with those in your own domestic economy.
And the data shows that, while we're a very small proportion on the whole of, particularly of the raw volume of Chinese publications, there are some areas where Australia is a real contributor to the highly cited stuff that China's doing. And I think space science, every second highly cited paper has Australian co-authorship. Areas like microbiology, psychology, clinical medicine, I think, around 1 in 5 of those papers. I mean, obviously, I guess that comes to your point that it's China's looking to collaborate with us in particular areas because they're where our strengths lie and it's in their interests. But they're very high figures, particularly with space science, 50%. How do you explain that?
Well, despite our small, Australia's population only accounts for 0.3% of the global population, yet we account for more than around 2-3% of global publications. So yes, compared with China, we're a small player, but we certainly punch above our weight. I don't want to downplay our prowess. And look, I think one of the reasons why we punch above our weight is that we do have this open attitude towards international collaboration. And probably the other thing, John, that just strikes me now as I think about it, is that our universities have historically been very well resourced. Now that may sound a bit odd, but you would know this very well as a commentator in this space. Australian universities have been well resourced up until recently. We have been able to hire some fantastic scientists, set up some fantastic laboratories, because we've also had an outward focus in selling education exports, notably to Chinese students. That, of course, has changed dramatically this year. So I think they're the basic factors for our success, but they're not factors that are guaranteed to be sustained into the future, that's for sure.
Well, of course, we were talking about this earlier, there's a real question mark over Australian research, not only the pandemic, which has really cut a big sort of wave through the resources that researchers have. Nobody really knows where that's going to land. There are also proposals by the Australian government to change the way that domestic teaching is funded, which would reduce opportunities for universities to use profits from teaching their domestic students to help subsidise their research. How much of a threat is all this to the collaborative research that we're doing with China?
It's massive from my point of view, John. There's a number of threats to the trajectory of Australia's collaboration with China and beyond. But let's not fall for some cultural arrogance here and imagine that we're just so wonderful, we'll always have international partners wanting to partner with us. Well, we're pretty good. But the facts are, material science again, we produce 2.2% of global publications. China produces 37%, right? So let's not delude ourselves that we're a heavyweight in many of these areas. We're not. Right, we rely on those connections. So we've got to be attractive partners. And as I said, I think we have been able to remain attractive because we have had well-resourced education institutions here. But that is, well, as of this year, we don't, as you said, we don't know where it's going to land, but it's not looking like it's going to be the case next year. But this isn't something that's just going to affect our partnerships with researchers in China. It's going to affect our partnerships with those in the United States as well. And it's a desperate concern to the sector and also Australia's long-term productivity growth.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Chinese researchers will be potentially looking a little bit askance at what's happening in Australia and the prospects for its research sector going forward. But presumably, many other countries are facing similar challenges, maybe not to quite the extreme extent of Australia, because Australia depends so much on international students to fund that research. But I mean, we're all in this crisis. So is there a chance that we'll just sail through, everything will drop for a while and then it'll pop up again?
There is a chance, but I think the point you made that we have been more heavily exposed to resourcing our universities based on international students. So if that does fall over, then Australia is more exposed. And look, that would be a tragedy. Australian universities, when you look at our innovation and technology ecosystem, we do not have the massive private corporations that the United States and China have, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Tencents, the Alibabas, and so on. In Australia, it's the universities that are really at the heart of our scientific knowledge creation ecosystem. So once you take away their resourcing and they become less attractive partners, we don't have a private sector to fall back on. So we're particularly exposed in that sense as well.
Yeah. Getting back to the US-China relationship, I think your report says that collaborative papers between the two countries have gone up something like 10% in the past year, or the last year that data was available for. That's at a time when the relationship between the two countries is looking increasingly rocky. Australia's not exactly in China's good books either, and yet went up 13%. Does this suggest that these sorts of relationships, there's something about them that's a little bit impervious to the geopolitical ruptions, at the macro sense?
Impervious is probably a bit strong a word, but you're absolutely right, in my view, as an economist who's been watching this space very closely for quite a while, that these interactions are far more resilient than many commentators give them credit for. So our latest report shows that despite the political tensions, the extent of scientific collaboration between Australia and China continues to increase. If you look in the trade space, for example, I've been watching this very carefully since the beginning of the year. Two-way trade in goods between Australia and China has never been greater. So I'm not trying to play down the risks. I'm not trying to, just shunt the risks to the side. There are very real risks, and actions like the Chinese government putting in place tariffs on Australian barley, decertifying meat processing facilities in Australia, meaning they can't export to China anymore. I'm not trying to downplay that at all. But the broader picture here is still one of strength. And I think, John, what that gets back to is so far at least, it's not guaranteed for the future, but so far the Australian and Chinese governments have had the good sense to let Australian households and businesses and universities, and Chinese government to let Chinese households, businesses and universities get on with engagement in the areas that both sides see as being in their mutual interests. And the fact that the scale of this goods, services and scientific collaboration is so strong does point to the incredibly deep and fundamental complementarities between Australia and China in these areas. So it's not, the trajectory is not assured, but it is far more robust than I think it's often credited for.
I wonder if there's something in the nature of research relationships that often gets missed in a lot of these sort of big level discussions. There's probably a helicopter view that government policymakers and probably particularly the security establishment have of the nature of these relationships, but among people on the ground, it's very much more a personal thing. Personal relationships that in some cases probably go back decades, and in some cases, I think, probably particularly in the humanities, the researchers involved have very little awareness that their respective countries are having a bit of argy-bargy that just goes completely over their heads. And is there a real kind of disconnect between the way research is seen from up high and the way researchers see themselves?
I think that's a fair observation. And I think the second point to follow up would be, so that means that there's space and scope for both groups to share with each other. If we care about Australia's national interests and Australia's national security, then I think we need to ensure that our researchers here are aware of some of the risks at the national security level that are often occurring, at the big picture level above their particular projects. So we want that the sharing of knowledge from the Australian government to the research community here to take place. And vice versa, we want our national security folks to understand where the best research is being done in these fields. They don't know where it's being done. It's the individual scientists themselves who know where the best research is being done and where the biggest value-added opportunities for collaboration lie. But look, on that point, I would say I'm actually heartened by what's happening in Australia and China. Last November, for example, the Australian university sector and the Australian government, including the security agencies, worked together, had a dialogue to put in place best practice guidelines for guarding against foreign interference. And as far as I know, from all of the talks I've had with governments, certainly the talks I've had with my colleagues in the university sector, the universities thought that was a really productive process and a great outcome. And guess what? So did the government side. So this two-way flow of information is something we need more of, but I'm actually confident it's happening.
We need to get onto the national security side of this argument, or this issue. But just before we do that, there's something else about the data that I wanted to interrogate a bit, and I guess that's the role of the Chinese diaspora. I keep thinking about the sort of World Soccer Cup about 3 tournaments ago when Australia actually managed to get to the knockout stage, and it did that by knocking out Croatia. I remember a commentator at the time saying, "Oh, our Croatians were better than their Croatians," and I'm wondering if there's something similar in the relationship with China, that the collaboration really is our Chinese collaborating with their Chinese. I mean, if you look at RMIT, for example, which has a real research strength in materials science, I think you'd be hard pressed to find very many of those RMIT professors who don't have Chinese surnames. So there's a heritage aspect to this relationship. I guess none of this is captured in this scope as figures.
No, it's not, John, but I would love to do the research. So if you know anyone who wants to fund that sort of fund that research, please put them in touch with me. Anecdotally, I've got the same impression that Australia's Chinese diaspora is an important factor at play here. Not the only factor by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one factor. But I just don't have the hard data. And of course, this is another aspect of the Australia-China relationship that is a real strength for Australia, those people-to-people ties. So it's not just trade, it's certainly not just resources, it's agriculture, it's services, and it's not just trade in goods and services, it's scientific collaboration, and that's enabled by these people-to-people ties. So I guess this gets back to my fundamental point about the Australia-China relationship, is that it's not just big, it's not concentrated, it's not just about iron ore, it's very broad and spans all of these different areas.
I guess one implication of that close relationship too is that for research or for academics in Australian universities who have Chinese heritage, the ability to collaborate with people from their home country or the country that their family come from is a very important part of the job for them. And if Australia were to stop collaborating with Chinese researchers in their areas, working in an Australian university would suddenly look like a much less attractive proposition for them. If something like that were to happen, do you have any idea how many Australian academics or academics of Chinese heritage we would be at risk of losing?
Well, John, you know this as well as I do, that the path to promotion in Australian universities is through peer-reviewed publications in those high-quality outlets. So if you kneecap Australian researchers that prevent them from doing that, basing themselves at an Australian university suddenly becomes a whole lot less attractive proposition. This is nothing about geopolitics. This is all about individual incentives. So look, I can't give you numbers, or I wouldn't even feel brave enough offering proportions, but it is certainly true to say that one of the sources of attraction for basing yourself in an Australian university is that you're in an environment where the university, where your employer and the Australian government promotes these connections. So if that flipped, it's going to take away part of the value proposition.
So getting onto the national interest, the national security aspect of this whole debate, I guess your fundamental argument, I think you used the term cutting off the nose to spite the face, that Australia doesn't want to do that. It has to manage the national security and national interest issues. But China is either the biggest game in town or very close, on its way to becoming the biggest game in town. We don't want to sideline ourselves from the biggest game in town without a good reason. But the counter argument, obviously, is that national interest implications of the way China is behaving in the world at the moment are very, very important. They're a real potential risk to Australia. This is something that warrants an abundance of caution, and we should be very, very careful about collaborative activities in those sorts of spheres. Both of those arguments seem to me to have merit. I guess the trick is finding the right balance between them. How do you do that?
Well, you do it in the way it's done at the moment, and that is at the individual project level, right? Everything you've said, John, is perfectly sensible, and I agree with it 100%. So I'm not suggesting that we can throw caution to the wind here, but the point is we don't. Individual universities undertake due diligence when it comes to their Chinese partners. And I think it's pretty clear that as China's behaviour has changed over the last 5 years, certainly under President Xi Jinping, Australian universities over time have become more attuned to these risks, just as actors in government have as well. So Australian universities now, when they're evaluating these Chinese partnerships, applying a level of due diligence that is very high, stronger than in the past. And then we have those regulatory frameworks like defence trade controls, where any international collaboration that involves a partner overseas does come under defence trade controls. So they're overseen by the Department of Defence. You don't get a much more important security actor than that at an individual project level. They get put to the Department of Defence, and the Department of Defence can squash them if they want. But as I said before, as we know, universities have a very strong compliance track record in that space as well. So that's the way you deal with it. You don't say there's some high-level tensions between the two countries, so let's block individual researchers from working with their partners. I mean, that's madness. You make sure those projects that Australian scientists are working on with Chinese partners are subject to due diligence and that regulatory framework applied by the Australian government.
Some of the issues can be pretty tricky to even notice, let alone manage. And I'm thinking of, like, Clive Hamilton brought up an issue that's happening in some of the publications involving Australian collaborators, where depictions of the NineDash Line, which is China's somewhat ridiculous claim to vast swathes of the South China Sea going almost down as far as Borneo, are sneaking into scientific publications that have nothing to do with the China Sea. They could be about biology on the Tibetan Plateau or whatever. And his assertion is that China is trying to normalise acceptance of its claim to the South China Sea through surreptitious things like that. And I can imagine there's a lot of other things that are happening that are similar in nature, just completely flying under the radar. They would never come to the attention of the defence controls people. When I looked at that issue, I couldn't even get any answers from most journals that I asked about it. What are you doing about this? So, I mean, this is part of the problem, isn't it? There's just so many different ways that China's behaviour is being asserted.
Yeah, and look, let it never be said that I disagree with Clive Hamilton on everything. I don't. On that particular example you're talking about now, I agree with Clive. So this is why we have a free press. We have academic freedom. So academics like Clive Hamilton can undertake the research in a free and uninhibited way and help unearth these genuine issues. And I'm going to line up with Clive on these every time, right? What I don't line up with Clive on is when he makes allegations and assertions and casts slurs on institutions and individuals and then fails to back that up with firm facts and evidence. I think that sort of approach, making a splashy headline and then moving on, but building that narrative, is very, very dangerous to Australia's national interest. That's the sort of thing that I'm going to push back against Clive Hamilton on.
So I guess moving from largely symbolic issues like depictions of the NineDash Line to the big issues in the headlines at the moment. So we've got, the United States saying it's going to do freedom of navigation exercises in the South Pacific Sea. Australia expressing support, even if it's not necessarily going to be part of those exercises. Obviously, we've got Hong Kong. We have perceptions that what's happening in Hong Kong and new security law there, maybe this is just a rehearsal for the real game, which is in Taiwan a couple of years down the track. We have a lot of claims about very, very harrowing human rights issues in Xinjiang. We've got problems on the China and India border. Xi Jinping's China seems to be increasingly out of step with global perceptions about how global players should behave. Is there a possibility that a lot of countries are going to decouple from China? And if we don't do that, then we'll be out of step with the rest of the world?
Well, my first point is everything you said about China's tilt towards being more authoritarian at home and aggressive overseas. I absolutely agree with it, 100%. At the same time, this is what makes the China relationship so complicated, right? And is why we don't want to, why it's inaccurate to paint it in simple black and white terms, because everything you've said is absolutely true. At the same time, we know two-way trade is at a record highs. Australian scientific collaboration with China is at record highs. Those people-to-people ties are absolutely brilliant for Australia's national interests. So we've got to manage those risks. And look, I think that's exactly what the Morrison government is doing. Frankly, my position on the way the Morrison government is handling the China relationship is that it's doing a pretty good job. I mean, I can quibble with little small issues, but I think in terms of pushing back on some of the more egregious aspects of China's behaviour, I think it's done that, and I applaud them for doing that. As to whether more countries are going to decouple from China, well, even in the case of the United States, which is leading this charge, even there, it's not black and white. I saw another piece of research recently that also looked at the components of an iPhone over the last few years. And now more of an iPhone's components are actually sourced from Chinese suppliers than they were just a couple of years ago. And our report shows that scientific collaboration between the US and China continues to increase as well. So I still think that's a fluid space. And in any case, the outlook for Australia is not the same as the outlook for the United States. The United States spends $500 billion on R&D every year. So too does China. Australia spends $25 billion. Another statistic I like to cite is that one Chinese company last year spent around $20 billion on R&D. That's Huawei. That is greater than the combined spending of all Australian companies put together on R&D. So the idea that we can just look at what the United States is doing, take their template and apply it here, and that'll somehow serve Australia's national interests, I mean, that is bizarre, and it's certainly not accurate.
So we have a crowdsourced question. What percentage of joint publications involved research that was above or well above world standard? It would be more interesting to look at those figures, i.e. the stuff that is rarely valuable, rather than the top line figure. I mean, I guess the figures you present about highly cited, which is top 1%, to some degree answers that question. But, you know, that above world standard, I mean, how would you respond to that question?
The way I'd respond to it is to get on the phone to the Australian Research Council and ask them to share with me their data. As far as I know, we know universities collect that data and send it to the Australian Research Council, but I haven't seen it publicly available. If I'm wrong, I would be absolutely delighted if a member of our audience could flip me an email and show me where I could view it. But yeah, you're right. In the absence of that data, the way we've tried to track the quality aspect is to look at those highly cited publications. And there China is number 2, but the trajectory is positive, where with our other major partners, it's sort of flatlining or falling.
Another question, this is from, I think we've just lost it, through a question from our friend Salvatore Babones at the University of Sydney, who always asks good questions. I'm keen to read it. James, you seem to consistently elide the difference between the Australia-based and Australian. Even John, in his question about Chinese surnames, implicitly assumed that Australia's Chinese academics were Australian. I'm myself an Australian-based researcher who is not Australian, and were I to put to American interests first, it would not be treasonous of me, but loyal. Similarly, isn't it likely that many, if not most, of the Australian-based scientists collaborating with Chinese institutions are Chinese nationals, and I guess by implication wouldn't see it as treasonous to put Chinese interests first?
I wouldn't jump to a conclusion. They would have to have, I mean, they'd be permanent residents of Australia. While they're living in Australia, Australian laws apply to them. It's not the laws of China that apply when they're working in an Australian university. It's Australian rules and regulations. And so it certainly doesn't strike me that they would have a strong inclination to put China's interests first above Australia's. And in any case, I really think we should be very cautious about viewing the world in those terms. That is, if we put China's interests first, then we must be putting Australia's interests second. Hang on, that is the whole nature of collaboration. That's the whole nature of trade. That's the whole nature of investment. You have two parties get together because both sides agree it's in their national interests. And in any case, look, whether it's an Australian researcher or a Chinese researcher, in the end, that's why we have things like defence trade controls, which apply equally across the board, no matter what your ethnicity or your passport says. And those systems are in place, and universities are quite diligent in complying with them.
You mentioned Huawei before, and there's certainly a perception about Huawei that despite all its protestations about being an independent company, it's not. It's required by certain laws to comply with demands by the Chinese state. There's similar perception about the Chinese universities, and last year the Australian Strategic Policy Institute compiled a database of research institutions, including universities, that it was calling out for having links to the sort of industrial military establishment. And basically it said, I think, 87 top Chinese universities that it counselled Australian universities to be very wary about collaborating with. Isn't that a fair point, that Chinese universities are operating within Chinese laws? They will be subject to requirements that wouldn't apply to the Australian universities from their own government, and collaborators in Australia really need to be aware of this?
Absolutely. And so I publicly welcomed ACRI's report, the one you're referring to. I think you can't complain about more data rather than less. So report, I think it was funded by the United States State Department, if I recall correctly. And I welcome that. I welcome that funding, and I welcome the research that ACRI did. I think it's good for Australian universities to be aware of those links. The ACRI report then went one step further, though. Rather than just documenting links, which I think is very useful, it then ascribed risk ratings to different Chinese universities. I remember a university that I used to work at, Shandong University, was described as very high risk. Well, anyone who knows the Chinese university system will know that Shandong University is the #1 university in Shandong province, a province of 100 million people, just like the University of New South Wales or the University of Queensland. And so I don't think it follows that we, just because ACRI ascribe it a very high risk rating, that Australian universities should automatically block off collaboration with that university, because it has some ties to the Chinese military. I mean, just think about this, John. We know that the University of Melbourne has extensive links with Lockheed Martin, right, and an American arms manufacturer, weapons manufacturer. it would be very unfortunate if the Chinese government were to say to a Chinese university, we can't work with the University of Melbourne because they're linked to the American military defense establishment. So I think we have to have some common sense here. And this gets back to the issue of these collaborations. You don't bar collaboration based on someone's name. You bar it based on what the research is actually looking at. And that's precisely what Australia's defence trade controls do.
We're running out of time. We have another question from Chumbo Ma to James. Publications are often originated from projects and funding. How do you think the current bad blood in politics between the two countries will affect funding allocation involving Chinese partners, e.g. Funding from the ARC? I've heard many ARC assessor comments on collaboration with Chinese universities. Do you think that will affect funding allocations as in this current round? It would be good to look into funding allocation data.
So the report that Michael and I have published does actually have one table that looks at ARC funding with collaborators in different countries. And I can tell you that China is far from top of the list. The United States is number one. I think the UK second. I think China's in fourth. It's only about 4%, it's about 11%, if I remember correctly, of project commencements that are ARC funded involve Chinese collaborations. And they're a number one collaborator in terms of producing output. So on that input side of things, the funding, China actually Chinese research doesn't actually receive a lot of ARC funding anyway, at least compared with their American counterparts.
Look, unfortunately, I think we're about out of time, which is a shame, because I can see there's been quite a lot of questions coming from people who are registered to watch this event. Look, I guess I've just got one closing question, which is, I don't think I've seen too many issues that arouse such passion, I guess, as Australia's relationship with China and the areas that I report on anyway. And there's a sense, I get a sense that people are pretty entrenched in their positions. People who are for it won't be dissuaded, and people who are against it similarly. Do you think that's right? Or do you think there may be a coming together, some sort of common ground between the two sides on this debate?
It's a challenge. I think you're right. There are a lot of entrenched positions. Look, for me, it comes back to facts and evidence. So I'm more than happy to come together with folks who have a different view as me, as long as we're talking about facts and evidence. If the conversation is not about facts and evidence and it's about allegations, accusations and slurs, then it's pretty hard to have a productive conversation in those terms. So if we can move that part of the discussion, then I think you will see some coming together of minds.
Look, thanks a lot, James. It's been a lot of fun, and thanks for the report. I agree with you. You can never have too much data, and some of the data in that report is really interesting. So yeah, I commend it to people. I think it's a good read.
Thanks very much, John.
Thank you, James and John. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. The report discussed today is also available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, James Laurenceson and John Ross. And thank you to all of our attendees. See you next time.